Okay, welcome to the second day of SRB026. Yesterday we went over biology and ecology, stock assessment. Today we'll just go over the report as it stands right now and get any input. And then we'll move on to the MSE work and monitoring today. You can run that, I guess.
Sure, you don't want to go through these, just the recommendation updates. So
Yeah. Just the new stuff. Well, that too.
it's just the old one. So they're the five paragraphs you added there, and I just put in recommended or request just to have that discussion again, just to confirm which one you want to go for, formally passing it to the commission, or if it's just something you want the secretariat to do by September, so it bypasses the commission.
Requested is by September?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Or it's just informal, it's just do it when you can, but ideally try and get it done.
Unless it's by SRB 32.
By SRB.
Okay, we'll deal with that. So let's go with, let's look at 17, 19, and 20. Kind of signaling the end of stock structure question. Yes, you're going to have publications to work on, but as far as high priority. 19 was recognizing that the new maturity ogives should be ready for the stock assessment this year, whereas the fecundity may not. And so this is recommending that fecundity not be kind of airdropped in between now and the next full assessment. That its time will come in the next full assessment. Just to avoid any shocks that may happen to people.
Speaking of the maturity ogives, we had some questions yesterday about the methods there. Hey, can we get back to that today? Talking about the spatiotemporal model or
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah. The third one, the 20 was recommending that looking at environmental drivers and that sort of thing, that be incorporated into the 5-year research plan. Which brings me to one that I thought of about 2 in the morning, which was we're wrapping up a lot of this biology and ecology stuff, and we're expecting a new 5-year research plan sometime in the summer, but we really didn't hear anything about what is next. Like what's the plan? Major projects moving forward for which you don't have to answer right now, but certainly, you know, if you're revising the 5-year research plan, it's something that we expect to see. But I guess doing a full assessment is an opportunity to identify gaps.
And I did recommend a couple. Fecundity being a good, but striving size at age being a second.
So I think, yeah, we'll basically change all those to Okay, let's go down to the stock assessment. There's no issues with those. So we had a couple of formal requests. One is to look at using a normal prior on natural mortality for all the models in that zone. That's a sensitivity analysis, so we'll just see if that possibly helps. Just close one short. 23 was requesting something equivalent to a retrospective analysis of management advice. I think I recall you did this before.
Yeah.
Something to inform the, but it was more what management decisions were.
I've done that, yeah.
Yeah.
That a
Not
few
a couple
times.
times over the years. But I've done something like this for the commission as well. There's previous decision tables. It's, yeah. That's my ideas.
So requested is okay? I mean, recommended requested on that one is,
I think really the distinction isn't so much for the staff, it's whether you want it elevated to the commission. So they take notice as well. Whether it's recommended or requested,
Okay,
we're
both
gonna,
of these
we're
should
gonna
be
work on it, so.
I still don't understand. I'll make a request. Well, I think we did request something once that,
You have a request from, it'll show you too.
so we can change those. 24 was about, you know, avoiding a situation where recruitment deviations in the projection don't jump back up to the average. Wherever they might be. So starting up with a random walk off the most recent reliable recruitment. There's not many alternatives to doing that. You can put a weight. So one of the things that we've done is use a weighted recruitment deviation where you can tune it with the weight parameter to have some weight beyond the starting point, which is the last recruitment deviation, the average being the other one. That can affect how fast it kind of comes back. '25 was deprioritizing incorporation of depredation. I think we, this, and I think the depredation we're talking about now may be slightly different. But I do recall that we recommended last year, this time, we presented a whole bunch of stuff on depredation. We're like, okay, it's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Stuff you were talking about yesterday seems slightly different. So again, just coming up with maybe a formal plan for looking at that. '26 could also be recommended instead of requested. The idea there is, and we've recommended this in the past, so I think it's time may have come. So anyway, but giving it a few years to do that. It's good. 32 would be the next one.
If you are comfortable doing it, perhaps a paragraph between 21 and 22 that just supports the bridging and changes so far as a jumping off point for whatever you see in the fall, just to note that we've made some changes and they seem acceptable so far, or whatever your opinions on them. Just to put a checkpoint there for me, and if the commission, when they look through this report, that will help them understand that we sort of signed off on changes to date, things like the updated PDO index, with the 6 bridging steps that I had.
That would be between 21 and 22, you're suggesting, or somewhere there?
It seems like that would be a logical place. Note the paper, note the changes, support the relatively minor updates to the assessment, and then the list of recommendations between now and the fall. Well, I don't think the wording is critical, just to note that, like a checkpoint in progress. Okay, so we've got 3 people that have.
Okay,
That's it, yeah. All right, with that, I think we can pull that down and bring up presentation for strategy evaluation, how strategy work. Should be good to go.
Okay, do we want to maximize that? All right. Good morning, everybody. This is a presentation on some of the MSE work and harvest strategy policy work that we've been doing. I just want to note, this is a Rep 1. So my apologies. I added a little bit at the last minute, and we just uploaded this revised presentation on Monday. So you might want to make sure you have this one. And everything is the same, except there's some additional slides at the end. So you can follow along if you have the old presentation right now. I'm going to talk about 3 things today. We're just going to do a check on exceptional circumstances. We're going to take a look at some of the work that I've been doing, looking at effects of weighted age in the PDO regimes and things that we've been showing the MSAB and what the MSAB's really interested in. And then I'll finish off with some harvest strategy policy updates, which has a few subsections within it. So first, exceptional circumstances. There's currently 2 exceptional circumstances in the draft harvest strategy policy. And the first one is just looking at the FIS WPUE or NPUE and making sure that the MSE simulations or projections are matching that or within the expectations. And then the second one was added, I believe, at the last SRB. And this was just to take a look at the realized coastwide mortality and make sure that it's within the simulated range of the MSE projections as well. So those are both stated in the draft harvest strategy policy. And then I've put down here some slightly modified text of what happens if an exceptional circumstance does occur. And so if an exceptional circumstance is declared, which is the SRB has a big part in declaring that exceptional circumstance, the MSE simulations are reviewed, consultation with the SRB and the MSAB. And where the new text is let me get the microphone here, is here with the mention of the commission. And the commissioners at our workshop noticed in the harvest strategy policy that there was no mention of how the commission is involved with the declaration of an exceptional circumstance. So they wanted just a little bit more clarity on that. So we put in present these recommendations to the commission, and the commission can recommend whether to update the OM or reevaluate the reference MP and alternative MPs. And then further consultation with the SRB and the MSAB, and then present these results to the commission to identify whether it's appropriate or not.
savor this for a moment.
Yeah, sure. And then I'll show you examples of how we look at these as exceptional circumstances and determine if they.
Oh, and what's the timeline for these steps here?
That's a good question. And so basically my thought on that is every year at the June meeting, I'll present these. take a look at the MSE simulations and see how they're performing. And then we can see, because that's when we'll have all the new data from last year to actually test it against. And then have the discussion with the SRB. And as you might notice here in the exceptional circumstances, we really want that to happen for 2 or more consecutive years.
So at year 3,
Right.
June of year 3, you identify an exceptional circumstance.
Right. Yeah. Well, no, we'd identify it in the second year. So for example, because if it happened twice, then it could be, then we can decide whether or not to declare it as an exceptional circumstance.
Okay, I guess I'm thinking like there's 1 year it falls outside.
Right.
Second year it falls outside.
And that would be the year that you
You don't
declare.
identify that until June of the next year.
No, well, okay, so I actually have a schedule. That's another thing the commission recommended, was actually putting this out in like a 3-year calendar. So maybe we can hold that off until I have this table that actually shows the process and have a bunch of arrows pointing to these things. It took me a while to figure out, but so I'll remind you. Savor a little more.
Well, yeah, is it intentional to have realized twice in the second bullet, second exceptional circumstance?
I think
In the
so.
Paper and in here.
Yeah, because the reason that I was thinking of realized there is because there's different mortalities. There's one, the decision that the commission made. So that's what they call the coastwide mortality, or the TCUY. And then there's when the fishery goes out, fishes, they actually don't match that exactly. So that's the realized coastwide mortality. And the MSE model can simulate the same thing. It has the actual determined TCUY, and then the fishery goes out and it doesn't always match it exactly. So I just wanted to be clear that this is comparing apples to apples. It's both realized what the fishery actually realized. And so I believe we had a little bit of discussion about this as an exceptional circumstance, because if the fishery was unable to catch the mortality limit, then that might be a sign that something's happening. So if I'm just trying to compare the decision the commission made with the MP TCUI, that's not going to capture the potential of the fishery not being able to capture or to catch the total mortality limit. So it's another little check.
That makes sense, Alan. It also makes me realize that you're showing the TCEY versus the actual catch.
To realize, I can direct you to a figure that Ian has presented as part of his assessment presentation, and it's typically, it has been before COVID, it's really close, like 99-98%. But during COVID, of course, it was less. But since COVID, it's also been a little bit less for various reasons. Right? I believe some of those reasons are just opportunities in other fisheries, like save fish, things like that, just not being able to finish up their quota at the end of the year. And that's why the season's a little bit longer sometimes. Yeah. Anything else on this slide?
No, I just, it threw me like simulated realized.
Yeah.
It's a little weird to read.
Yeah. If you have any suggestions on wording.
But I understand what you're talking about.
Yeah. And I'm just trying to be really clear on that. And then also, if somebody other than myself has to create this, they can do it correctly.
It's just that, I guess, coastwide mortality has multiple meanings.
Right. Yeah, I have to partition that in the simulations, keep track of them appropriately. Okay, so let's take a look at that first exceptional circumstance here. The coastwide FIS numbers per unit effort. This is numbers is what is used in the stock assessment to fit to. It's also a little bit cleaner to compare, I think, because now we're not bringing in the weighted age, but we can easily do a comparison of WPUE, which would also bring in the concept of how weighted age is being simulated, if that's really going off the rails as well. But this is NPUE, so just to bring you up to speed with this plot, I've shown this in the past. We have the past, so this is up to 2022 here, and that's the lighter colors. In the range of the bars there is from the MSE simulation, so that's the projection from the operating model. And the yeah, I'm showing a 95% prediction interval, and then you can see there's a little bit extra in there. That's the 99% prediction interval. I just wanted to put it in there. The yellow dots are the observations from the space-time model output, which do have uncertainty on it, but I did not plot the uncertainty from that. I just plot the actual estimate from that. And so you can see historically, which the model is conditioned to, it's bouncing around, but within those confidence intervals. Now I'm starting at 2023 as the projection because this operating model was last conditioned in 2022. So I haven't reconditioned the operating model in a number of years. Updated a few things, but these are the projections. And now you can see that the space-time model is well within the range of projections from the operating model. Another note here is I'm using projections from the operating model with an SPR 43%, even though the decisions made by the commissions have been closer to an SPR of 52% or 50%. And the reason is this is sort of their accepted, this is their accepted interim management procedure, the 43%, and decision-making variability is simulated in the projections. So I want to make sure that it's capturing that decision-making variability appropriately, and that under the reference management procedure, it's still within the range of what is being realized.
So the decision-making variability is incorporated in there, the answer.
Yes. And yeah, we'll see that in the mortality in a moment, how that plays out. That's the next slide, I believe. So now this is the total mortality, again, simulated with an SPR 43%. So just to point out, now looking historically from 2023 and earlier, you see that the input total mortality, which is a fixed number up through 2023, is actually almost exactly on. I can't remember why it's slightly off there. And then I think I forgot to plot it for 2023, but it's going to be very, very close. And that's what I was talking about, the updates to the OM. I'm not reconditioning it, but when I come to a new year, I now know what was caught in 2023. So I put that in and fix it and then start the projections. And then what you can see for the projected years, 2024 and 2025, that the actual realized total mortality, and the 2025 is actually the limit because we haven't realized that yet, but it's actually the limit. So it might actually be a little lower than that based on recent trends. That these mortality levels are at the lower end of this confidence limit, but within the confidence band or the uncertainty band from the operating model projections. And that's because the commission has been making decisions that are below or a lower fishing intensity than the 43%. So that the decision-making variabilities, is capturing that uncertainty along with all the other uncertainties. So the projections are within that. I want to give you a bonus plot here. This is not an exceptional circumstance, but I thought, well, let's just take a look at the estimated spawning biomass from the projections in the operating model and from the ensemble assessment as well. And so the ensemble assessment projects out 3 years to 2027. This is the 2024 assessment. And, but I didn't actually plot the projections of the ensemble assessment. But you can see that the operating model in black And the ensemble assessment spawning biomass is less than the median, but within the confidence range of that. And really what's happening there, again, this operating model has not been conditioned in a number of years. It's conditioned on an old stock assessment. And as Ian showed yesterday, showing retrospectively, we've had this sort of updating to lower spawning biomasses, which has been largely due to the fishery CPUE data. So they're not completely out of sync, but you can see they're sort of trending differently or going away from each other. So this is just a note to me that it's probably a good time to recondition, bring them back in alignment. Okay, so a summary of the exceptional circumstances. The observations from both of those tests were within the simulated intervals. There didn't seem to be anything really of great concern. The simulated spawning biomass from the operating model was above the estimated spawning biomass from the ensemble's stock assessment. And as I mentioned, that was largely because of the OM hasn't been conditioned, is conditioned to an older stock assessment. And the current stock assessment has subsequently decreased its estimates of spawning biomass. And so overall, the simulations seem to remain relevant for this, but a number of recent improvements suggest to me that it's probably time to recondition the operating. And I believe it was an SRB recommendation in the past that after the full stock assessment, the operating model is reconditioned.
So, I mean, the first slide you showed was that the operating model actually looks like it's doing pretty well, projecting NPUE.
Mm-hmm.
Why is spawning biomass so much different?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure off the top of my head. The only thing that is different, that the only difference in the calculation is the bringing of the weighted age, but weighted age changes so slowly, and that I don't think that's going to be a big departure in the simulations. Yeah, that's something worth looking into.
I'd be careful about showing I appreciate the bonus plot and stuff, but the idea of exceptional circumstances is to find a condition that is wrong, and that was a bit confusing to see.
Okay.
Okay, and one not, whereas, and one of them was not an official exceptional circumstance, so.
Yeah, and it was the recommendation of the SRB to use data as exceptional circumstances rather than derived outputs. Okay, so that's exceptional circumstances. I'll move on if that's all right. So what I want to talk about now is some investigations we've been doing. We've been doing these for a number of years, but we expanded on that investigation in this last year, partly at the interest of the MSAB. And so first of all, we cannot control size of age or environmental effects on Pacific halibut, and thus they're modeled as the variability in the operating model. But the fun thing about the MSE and the operating model is we can investigate scenarios, and that's something I do really like to do, and it's helpful to understand the patterns, but we have to be very careful that we're not using these to define the management, the best performing management procedure. So it's useful to understand the assumptions and how different regimes can affect Pacific halibut, but we have to be careful that it's not integrating over the full range of uncertainty. So here is on the left is an example of some simulations of weighted age, showing just, the differences. It can stay low and then go high, or it can go high pretty quickly in the simulations. You know, these are 100-year projections, I think, but it's showing you that weighted age is variable and the shaded area is the past, and that the projections are not, you know, outside of what's been observed historically. On the right are two simulated PDO regimes. And so you can see historically, it's this is the percentage of time in a positive PDO. So historically it's fixed. So you see there's a negative PDO going to a positive PDO, and then it starts simulating this semi-Markovian process of switching. And it's the top has about an average, I think, of about a 30-year period. And the bottom is more like a 15 to 20-year period. And so we've moved to the bottom with a 15-year period because you see there's still these effects after simulating out 100 years. And depending on where you calculate your performance metrics, if you calculate it here versus here, you get different results. So we really wanted to integrate over both PDO and the long term. So we just reduced the period a little bit. But the idea here is, okay, so what happens if we fix weighted age or we fix the PDO and we don't let them vary? What happens to the stock and the outcomes of these management procedures? So we took a look at historical weighted age as shown in this plot, and this is for ages 1 through 20. And we defined 3 different periods. We defined here the around 1975-ish. We called that a high period of a 5-year period, and we averaged weighted age, and then we just fixed weighted age at that, and that's what we call high. And we did the same thing for low, which is in the late 2010s. And then there's a slight difference in the current weighted age where younger fish seem to be larger, but older fish seem to be smaller than that low period. So we've also defined a current period to be more consistent with what we're seeing today. And then for the PDO, we just simply fixed it at a low or a high PDO because there's a number of different processes in the operating model that are dependent on the binary 0 or 1 PDO. And as Ian presented yesterday, average recruitment is either low or high with the low or high PDO. And it's about 1.4 times greater during a high PDO, the average recruitment. And you can see over the past, this is the plot on the bottom is the recruitment H0 recruits from the 2 long time series models. And you can see that for across the different PDO regimes. In the operating model, there's also linkages to the distribution of H0 recruits. So the operating model has coast-wide spawning. They produce a bunch of recruits, and then the model distributes those to the different regions. And that's dependent on the PDO as well. And then the movement is also dependent on the PDO. And those were things we developed a number of years ago that we just found that we had to put in to explain the data that we're fitting to. So here's, you can see the historical PDO on that plot in the bottom, but I just want to note that Ian also presented the updated analysis of the PDO, where this entire period is now classified as a negative PDO, which is going to have a big effect on the operating model because it starts with the PDO in that last year, and then it simulates that Markovian process of when it will switch. So the operating model right now is simulating a positive PDO in the recent time period. With the updated PDO, it'll now switch to a negative PDO, and it'll start with that. So there will likely be some different results. But this analysis is really going to look at what happens if it's always negative or always positive. So we've done these simulations, and then we'll look at the spawning biomass today and then the TCUI, the mortality output from the management procedure under different states of high or low weighted age, and then high low current weighted age, and then high or low PDO, which I'm calling high or low recruitment here. That's the big effect from the PDO. And what you can see is because we're fixing weighted age immediately at high or low or whatever, it has an immediate effect. And so for the red and orange, which is the high weight scenarios, it jumps up immediately, but that's really unlikely. But that's the reason we show it as a scenario. But it shows you that weight has a big effect on the spawning biomass. And so if we, so those two are the high weights, but the PDO, or the average recruitment, also has quite a large effect on the spawning biomass as well. When we look at the current weight in the green colors, you can see that its spawning biomass is low, and it's actually about where we've been estimating it in the stock assessment. And that the PDO also has an effect, but not as large of an effect, maybe a proportionally the same, but absolute value is not the same. And then when we look at the low weight scenario, we see that low weight, slightly higher spawning biomass, and still has an effect of the recruitment. So I think this was helpful for people to understand. It's like, oh, wow. So these two factors can have quite a large effect on the spawning biomass and what amount of fish are out there. Now, when we look at the TCUI, similar results. The effective weighted age is pretty much immediately, and now recruitment, which came in slowly into the spawning biomass, has a much quicker effect in the TCUI because they're selecting younger fish basically than the spawning biomass would be calculated from. And so here again we have the high weight, big effect on the TCUI. Now we can understand why in the past we've had TCUIs close to 100 million pounds, up above 80 million pounds, and it was largely a part of the weighted age. And now when we look at this, the green current weight is actually above the blue lines, which was opposite from the spawning biomass. And then the blue lines are actually the lower part of that in the TCUI. And it just shows you that the demographics are affecting spawning biomass and the TCUI and have a little bit different outcomes because of the selectivity from the fisheries and then the maturity being different ogives, basically. So it showed, and it also shows you that that current weight versus the low weight, what weighted age looks like across the different age classes has an effect on the outcomes as well. So this is all still preliminary stuff that I was showing the MSAB, and they found it to be pretty interesting. And so in summary, they both have a large effect on spawning biomass and the TCUI, and a lot of stakeholders and people involved in the MSAB are starting to really understand the variability that we've seen over the past and why, we might not be able to manage to an 80 million pound TCUI. The demographics, as I mentioned, have an effect, and this has been very helpful. The MSAB is very interested in this and really wants to have us at the Secretariat work on ways to show this partitioning, but still present it as the total uncertainty across these. So I'm trying to figure out a way maybe to shade when it's a low or a high or something like that to show how this uncertainty can be partitioned into these, but still show the full range of uncertainty. So they made a request at the MSAB meeting last month, and that was they wanted before next year, actually, or as soon as the Secretariat can, they wanted to have some simulations showing low recruitment, low weighted age with a couple of different management procedures. Low recruitment, current weighted age, and then high recruitment and low weighted age. And so they just want to see what's the effect of these different scenarios on the outcomes of these different management procedures and try to understand that a bit more. So I think that's it on this. That's the work that I've been doing. Yes, that's right. So I'll leave it up on the summary slide for a little bit in case you have any questions or suggestions how we might proceed with this.
I think this is fascinating. Is it
It's
fair?
fun.
Yeah, and surprising. I mean, is it fair to conclude that the historical variation in spawning stomach biomass has been driven more by changes in weighted age than by changes in recruitment?
It certainly has. I mean, I think weighted age has played a very large part in it. But the other thing we have to remember is the 1987 year class. It was a huge year class. Was it 3 times greater than any other? Two something. Yeah, it was
It's the next biggest year.
yeah, it was massive, and it
It
came
during a
right
period of high weighted
right at
age.
that
Yeah,
same
yeah, yeah.
time. So now you have one cohort going through the population, high weighted age. And so it's really that combinatory effect that really brought the TCY. But according to these simulations, I think that, I'll go back to spawning biomass. You can see here that the weighted age in these simulations is the weighted age is necessary to get that large spawning biomass that we observed. So even with a large 1987 year class, it wouldn't have been as large without the high weighted age. So it's certainly a
This is
large.
fascinating because my sense is the general understanding is that recruitment variation is what's driving changes in productivity,
Right.
and growth variation is there, but not something you need to worry about too much.
But
And
we've
this is
seen,
suggesting that it's the opposite, right?
Yeah.
That both of those things are really here, and
yeah.
maybe the growth is even more important to understand than the recruitment.
And it's mainly just because of the wide range we've observed historically. And, we've seen it's just, this is what really fascinates me when I present this. When I present this plot, I look at, say, age, like, I don't know, an age here that was 80 pounds on average. I think that's like 15-year-old in 1970s. And now that's less than half its size on average. That's a pretty big difference.
Because it's showing for a while that the decline over the last 20 years is large.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why we've moved also away from a static reference. Is what is the reference point? 1970s, 1930s, current? Like, yeah, it's so different.
So given this, which I hadn't fully understood before you showed this, this suggests to me that the biology program should be focusing much more heavily on growth.
And that was one of the main research topics that Ian presented yesterday. And that's where we both agree the research program is, we should be moving more into understanding changes in size of age, which they've been doing some work on already.
And you look at it in terms of annual size at age changes, or do you like in the projections, are you modeling cohort specific growth trajectories?
I'm not, it's a pretty simple way that I'm modeling weighted age. And that's why I think some more research would be really helpful to help us put together a better model, how to simulate weighted age into the future. So our initial cut at this is what we did first, is to just do a simple random walk of weighted age. So it's a slow process changing. And then I've tuned that to sort of match historically. But there's 2 deviation parameters on that. One deviation parameter, so you have all those ages. One deviation parameter says everything's going up. And then there's another cohort or age specific deviation parameter that can move them, within a year a little bit different. So things aren't always just going like that. They're sort of, wiggling across the ages. That's not bringing in cohort specific growth. And that's something that we really started investigating just this year. We started creating some plots and try to understand that. But there's been a few students that have tried to investigate cohort year specific growth and haven't seen any real compelling evidence of either one in there. It's just, there's such a mixed bag.
I mean, the difficulty is that if you you do it in an arbitrary way, you could get an age 4 fish that is smaller than it was when it was age 3.
Yeah, and so, so I do have a constraint in the random walk. That can't happen. I do constrain against that. I think it can be, because these are average weights across the population, that it is possible for the average of age 5 fish next year to be less than it was this year if it was trimmed, you know, large fish were caught or whatever it was. Yeah, yeah, but I've constrained against that, and I really want to keep things more monotonic and increasing over the cohorts. But this is where I think a lot of improvement could be made in MSE is the simulation of the weighted age into the future. But I'd like to do a little bit of research to have a better background on what the process is, so I can simulate those processes. Another thought there. Oh, the other thought that I had is, you know, we've been collecting a lot of really good weighted age data in recent years. And so now we're getting, every year we get a little better picture, a little more detailed picture of it. And I believe, talked to Ian and others about this, how are weighted age determined historically? And I think it's a little bit of a black box, isn't it, Ian? Some of the work being done there, how it was determined. So it's much more smooth historically, as you can notice in that plot. But as we're collecting more data from our current FIS and our cohort sampling programs, we're starting to get a better picture of how those individual cohorts are changing relative to each other. And so that's why we did this low. I have to go back, sorry. And because you see it's much less smooth in these recent years. And we're really beginning to understand. It's like, oh, look at what's happening with these young fish, but look what's happening with the old fish. So I think since, you know, it's been probably 5 or 10 years since students have investigated these cohort effects, year effects, we might have more power to detect.
I don't know how they plan to do it or how you plan to do it, but we've seen some pretty drastic changes in weighted age for herring. So I did some work looking at cohort specific growth curves and just estimating a simple Ford-Walford relationship by cohort. And then you can model patterns in the parameters of the Ford-Walford, and you'll get stuff like this. You'll get, you know, some cohorts will start growing faster, whereas the ones that are already in there are already on a board, and you'll get this kind of scrunching. So the behavior that you're trying to do arbitrarily with autocorrelations and correlations,
Right.
you can actually put more biological, think about it.
And that's what I would love.
And then you can drive like the alpha parameter of the Ford-Walford, like you can drive that with environmental.
Yeah.
Drive each parameter with a different variable. You can do all kinds of
Yeah.
weird stuff. You can make it density dependent. I think we do density.
Right. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of work here. The research program has been doing some really, really interesting work on size of age. I think you're publishing that paper soon, Joseph. Is that the?
There's a paper in review.
Yeah. Great. So yeah, I think in the next few years we can prioritize some of this work.
I think I got the idea to do that in a farmer's paper
Oh, really?
for I think it was the Wakefield, not the Wakefield, the
Moat Symposium.
mold, yeah, the
Yeah.
mold. First, those really mold ones. I think that's what we should do.
Yeah, I've seen those in a while. All right, so that's the fun that I've been having with this. Kept everything at the coastwide level at this point in time. But in the past, I've actually looked at regional differences in Nalpus biomass and stuff, and that's actually pretty interesting as well. But I want to keep it simple because now we're crossing recruitment and weighted age, and there's a lot going on here. But the MSAB is certainly interesting.
Then you have to get some way for fish to move to a new region and merge with the growth pattern that may be different in
Yeah.
that region.
That's what we need to understand is the growth trajectory defined at a very young age? Can it change when they move? And so, yeah, there's a lot of area for research here.
We have done that. Sam did some of that.
Yeah.
It's flatfish models,
Okay.
spatial stock area models. Then
Yeah. So that'll be fun coding.
yeah. I don't think stock synthesis will do it.
No, and that's why I've written my model. The operating model is written. Okay, so if I may move on to the harvest strategy policy. And I think we'll be done this MSC section pretty early. I thought more time would be spent on the maturity and assessment, but this is good. So in April of this year, we had a workshop with the commissioners, which went really, really well to discuss the draft harvest strategy policy. They were very engaged, which was really, I really enjoyed it. It was really good working directly with the commissioners on this. So I felt it was very successful. They had many edits for the harvest strategy policy, and they suggested actual wording, which was really nice. We talked a lot about hierarchical objectives, which I'll show you in a minute. And then they wanted to present a typical schedule of annual events, which is getting at your sort of calendars, so something like that. So the process on this is then we edited the draft harvest strategy policy, sent it back to commissioners, and then we may have another workshop, or we may discuss this at a work. So we're still deciding what's going to happen over the summer. So the first thing I want to talk about are the objectives. And we had really good discussion with the commissioners about what the objectives are. And so I'm just going to show you briefly here. There's basically three objectives. And one objective is the sustainability objective at the top here in green. And that's to maintain the female spawning biomass above 20%, at least 95% of the time. So that one has to be met for a management procedure to be considered. And then the second objective there is to maintain the long-term female spawning biomass above 36%, at least 50% of the time. And this is really more of like an MSY type objective, fishing objective. And that one also has to be met for a management procedure to be considered. Now, those two, because they can eliminate management procedures, we thought, well, those are the objectives defining the management procedures that are actually acceptable. So they're defining a subset of management procedures that are acceptable for further evaluation. So then once you have that subset defined, you can then evaluate management procedures that meet those two objectives. And this is why it's hierarchical. And we can evaluate those in terms of fishing yield and the variability in the yield. And so this used to be two separate objectives. And what we thought is really the evaluation is the balancing the trade-off between these two objectives. And so we proposed to the commissioners, let's combine those and create a single objective to balance the trade-off between maximizing the sustainable average coastwide mortality limit and minimizing annual changes in the coastwide mortality limit. Now, this isn't a clear measurable objective. I needed like this one, Sean. But it it does show that the trade-offs are being examined there and that they haven't really decided what is the optimal trade-off between these two. So in presenting these results, we would present those trade-offs and I've shown some plots to the MSAB as a test on some of this stuff. But really the hierarchical sense of this is on the top are defining those acceptable management procedures. In the bottom of that subset is defining is looking at the space in which the commission would operate in or be deciding among those MPs and deciding on a reference management procedure based on those trade-offs. And so it's really hierarchical in that sense. Went over this with the MSAB, and the commission is still considering this, so I wouldn't call this really final by the commission. This is part of what they're considering in the draft, and we'd walk through in another workshop with them. But the MSAB took a look at these, and they wanted to reword the objectives, and so they have a recommendation to reword the objectives in this way. Very similar to the first two objectives. What they really changed was that third objective, and subject to meeting the previous two objectives, really making it clear that this hierarchical sense, maximize sustainable coastwide yield while minimizing annual changes in the coastwide mortality limit.
Where your biomass limit reference point is actually a dynamic.
Yes, the 20% and the 36% are dynamic.
Changing time.
Yes. And that's some work we did in 2019 and presented in determining these reference limits. And that's work that I do want to repeat with a new updated operating model in evaluating these reference points under these different scenarios of weighted age and recruitment as well. You know, do it fully integrated and then look at if weighted age is low and recruitment's low, weighted age is high and recruitment's high, and vice versa, and crisscross all those, that what are the outcomes of the optimal reference points there. And what we found in 2019, it was actually pretty stable in terms of relative reference points. That the optimal outcome for a management procedure, that these reference points were stable. I forgot how I said it. But it's work that I want to repeat and really have a good look at these reference points under different scenarios and what that means that they're being and that they are dynamic.
The difficulty is if you get in a situation of low productivity, you'll be fine because these reference points are going to adapt to that.
Yep.
But the absolute spawning biomass is going to make, it's not going to be an economical fishery.
And that is exactly where we've been for the last 3 years. And so we have proposed an objective for the MSE process that is based on a more absolute measure. And so one suggestion there was to not say keep the bus spawning biomass above 150 million pounds or whatever, you know, but to say keep the spawning biomass above the estimated spawning biomass in 2023. So you're basically defining your reference point on history. And that was that's an estimated low point. People didn't like where they were at in 2023. So we'd want to stay above that was the idea. The MSAB and the commission is still struggling to, they understand the objective, but I think they're struggling to determine or still thinking about it, whether that is a reasonable objective to bring. There's some concern about that.
One of the difficulties is that sometimes it's not under your control.
Yep.
Like to set any kind of, like, you know, like number 2, maintain it above something 50% of the time, but your halibut seems to do what it wants to do and you take some yield out. I mean, it's, so we've had some conversations on the East Coast of putting some wording where it's specific that the fishery will not cause this thing to happen. So we haven't actually worked out the details, but something like for objective one, for example, that the fishery will not cause a reduction from. So like based on how much variability you have, for example, in weighted age and how it can really drive the stock, you may change 95% may happen all. Maybe crossing that threshold without any fishing at all.
Right.
But I
So,
thought those were dynamic.
That is exactly why we are using dynamic,
Right,
because
so you don't
it
have to-
separates the fishing effect from the.
so
effects
that's
we
what you're
can't
saying. So
control.
the 95% is fairly stable. Okay, so let's say that it is, then that's used as the base. So the fishery will not cause a further reduction. So if the stock naturally, I don't know, maybe that's what you found, where it showed is that
Yeah,
the stock naturally is going to stay above this thing 95% of the time, in the absence of fishing. You know that that's true?
we actually don't test for that. I haven't calculated that, or it's easy, I could.
That's what we're getting at, right? Is that, well, we don't actually know
Oh.
what 95%, if it's even in our control to achieve that.
Right, right.
So, you do it, when you go to do a small pelagic, you automatically find, well, you can't use 95%.
But so, yeah, so the question there is, in an unfished sense, is it's 20% of what? It's 20% of the highest biomass we've ever seen. It's 20%.
I'm not talking about the reference point. I think that's fine, right? You've got the
Right.
dynamic reference point.
Right.
It's 20% of some unfished average.
Right. But in comparing the unfished, in the absence of fishing, will it stay above that reference point? That's when you have to define that in an absolute sense, in the absence of fishing. Because that reference point in the absence of fishing is always 100%. So it's always above 20% because there's no fishing. So you'd have to define what is the point.
Well, I don't know, maybe that's what I'm asking. Does
Yeah.
that actually happen? Because if you look at for herring, it doesn't. Like, you don't fish the stock, even if you put a dynamic reference on there, right? Its range of variability is such that it's going to go below 20% of whatever unfished you have, more than 95% of the time.
But isn't the RSP relative to the unfished?
Yes.
So by definition,
Yeah,
it has to be there at 100%.
it would be in an unfished state. It's always at 100%. It's always above 99%. The question is, so if these are your biomass, and let's say we get into a low productivity regime down here in the lower green, less than 200 million pounds, what is the reference? Is it a biomass up here? Is it a biomass here? And so that's why with Pacific halibut, it's so challenging to use static reference points or absolute reference points. When I first came to IPHC, was it high weighted age, low recruitment, or defined a reference point of something like that? It's been years since we've done that, but they defined a state of weighted age and recruitment, spawning biomass under that scenario, and then everything's relative to that. But that's arbitrary.
Yeah, you can't do that in this case.
Yeah. So that's why we use the dynamic, but I think I get what you're saying, Sean, and it would be interesting. I'll consider maybe how to show that variability in the spawning biomass over time in the absence of fishing. What levels can it go to? I might have done that. I've certainly done it with fishing and showing how often does it go below what we estimated in 2023, for example. And it was like a 1 in 3 chance of going below that value that we saw in 2023 still. So, but, and, you know, this is some of the criticisms we've had for other fisheries with high variability, like Pacific hake. It could be under the less than the management target without any fishing. And we've done simulations to show that as well.
Yeah, and I think, I guess my point was that we think about defining objectives that are specific to the fishing effect.
And that's, yeah, it's not worded in that way, I guess, but that's where the dynamic zero is why it is used, because it's separating that fishing effect from the environmental effect. We've used a number of different plots, and I can direct you to those, but both Ian and I have been presenting this to the commission and the stakeholders and helping them understand. And we present a line that shows this is the biomass that we predict if there was no fishing. We show how much that's changed. And then we show this is the estimated actual biomass from the stock assessment. And one interesting thing is the unfished spawning biomass has been continuing to decline through recent years, but the estimated spawning biomass has remained pretty steady, pretty constant. And that shows you that management has been having an effect of maintaining or stabilizing the spawning biomass while environment has been causing reductions. And in my mind, that's a success of management. Yeah. And it's just one of those things we can't control that's putting us in the state where we're at, where the economics comes into play.
A different question about this. Have you thought about different ways to operationalize that C there?
Yeah.
And the ratio of the two?
I
or
know,
something like
yeah,
that?
yeah.
Because it's not operational. Like,
Yeah, no, to be honest, I haven't, other than how to present it. And the, you know, the commission and the MSAB, they like flexibility. They like the ability to do evaluations. So, but I do like that idea to consider a way to operate. Say the word.
make it work.
Yeah, I'll write it out.
Well, it's a huge step to have something where you could work this and choose a procedure, let them, here's your range of possible procedures that pass A and B. And they'll have something to talk about every 3 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can't do it every year. That's the point,
Yeah.
right?
And that's where I'll get at in the schedule.
And it's probably, by the time you get to C, you're not talking massively different. things anyway, they're within your decision-making variability.
Yeah. And
Not
that,
even less, actually.
I think they are, and that's sort of the key and why we phrased it in the plot as the short-term management objectives informing a reference MP. We've been thinking about that. That's actually the space that the commission is typically operating in during their decision-making process.
Just can't have, let it happen.
There's still a lot of complexity hidden under that annual change one as well, right?
Yeah.
For example, if you set it for a certain number of years, your annual change is really low during the period, but then when you update it, it could be larger than it would be.
And we presented that to the MSAB as well. I calculated with a annual assessment and a triennial assessment, but using the FIS in the non-assessment years, calculated the change in the years where there was an assessment for both of those. So over a 10-year period, I matched them. And then the change in the years without an assessment in the triennial, and it was exactly that. It was like a much lower change, but when the assessment came along, it was catching up, you know, and so it was a larger change. So on average, the triennial had a lower variability over a 10-year period, but it had higher potential single year variabilities than the annual assessment.
Yeah, I mean, we probably have already, but push them a little more to define specifically what it is that they want to avoid. achieve. And I think it probably comes down to avoiding large declines in TCUY.
Yep.
1 year to the next.
Yeah, we've used in the past, they said they've had a 15% threshold and we've introduced that and then we found no management procedure that met that. So it was like, well, we can't have that. But until we introduce constraints, things like that, or really back off this. But the decision-making variability now, even though they are sometimes trying to reduce that variability, the simulations are showing how to decrease that variability. Done a bit naively because we just couldn't figure out how to mimic decisions of decision makers. That's a really hard thing to do.
Yeah, sure.
But it's interesting because now your next workshop, you can pretty much focus on this.
Yep.
Dig into issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's helpful to have this hierarchy here. These must be achieved. And we look at a
Okay.
subset of achievements.
Oh,
That
good.
limits the decision space.
Yeah, and we're also trying to really highlight that sustainability is at the top of this as well. But even though they do have this flexibility, sustainability has. All right, any other questions on objectives? So another or outcome of this workshop was the suggestion of introducing or including a schedule of events in harbor strategy policy. And so this is something Commissioner Waddell sent some examples from tuna stocks, I believe, and they have these tables of schedules of events. So what we've done is we have these different columns with basically different years. They represent years. And so we put in example years here, like 2025. But this is, starting at any point in time, this could be a schedule of events. And then we have what happens with different data and different research or different concepts within the MSE. For example, the FIS Coastwide Index happens every year. So it gets a Y, which is a yes. There's a FIS index every year. A full stock assessment happens every third year. So there's a Y on every third year. And then the update stock assessment is in those intervening years. Commission TCY decisions are made every single year. And then here you see the MSC is updated. And that update right here is following a full stock assessment. So you do the full stock assessment 2025, MSC OM would be updated following that full stock assessment. Now note here is we didn't want to have to pin ourselves to doing a reconditioning of the operating model every 3 years. Talking with people like Doug Butterworth, he always said things like 5 years or something like that. And so what we thought is instead of having to recondition this operating model every 3 years, if things are running great, we want to reevaluate MPs or the operating model is working well, that we really set it at a 6-year interval. So it still matches the full stock assessment. But in that third year, we can decide whether or not to recondition it. And so that's where we have an X. So an X says it may be done, but doesn't have to. Now, this is where the exceptional circumstances come in. And I spent way too much time trying to figure out these little arrows. But holy cow, it's not easy. And so, okay, so we have exceptional circumstances checked in 2025, which is what we're doing now. Oh, and because the MSE operating model is reconditioned in 2026, we wouldn't necessarily check exceptional circumstances because it's actually conditioned to those data. Yeah, yeah. If it is, there's something wrong with the conditioning process. So we don't check for those in that year because there's nothing to check. But then 2027, we check. We consult with the SRB and MSAB. We present to the commission. And we're not going to reevaluate an MP because we haven't had 2 potential years for that to happen. But I put a star there, which it says an exceptional circumstance can be declared after 2 sequential instances, unless recommended by the commission outside the normal process. So it's a star. And I think this is where you're right, Olaf, in that this is a 3-year process. In the second year, check for an exceptional circumstance, consult. Now, if an exceptional circumstance is declared in that second year, then going into the third year was when we would do the reevaluations, right? Because it would take a little while to get that process started.
And given the life history, that seems like a acceptable timeline.
Okay.
Things aren't gonna go crazy off the rails in a 3-year period.
Right. And plus this has a presentation of status things through an update stock assessment as well. Now, this is where it gets complicated because X with a 1 superscript is if the MSD operating law is not updated, we would continue the process of checking exceptional circumstances. And so then that process repeats. And then when we get to the end of this 6-year period for the operating model, then MP would be reevaluated whether or not an exceptional circumstance was, because that's the end of the 6-year period. So yeah, I don't even know if this is the best way to present this, but it's one way we came up with it.
It makes a lot of sense after you walk
Okay.
through. It's hard to figure out. So
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, and there's a similar one, I think, I don't know if it's Southern Bluefin tuna or another stock. I forget which one, but it had all these arrows and stuff too. And that's where I was inspired to do this. So the last thing in the schedule of events is updating the harvest strategy policy document. So we had a discussion with the commissioners that they were like, well, how often should we update the harvest strategy policy document? And it's like, well, we shouldn't do this every year. But so we have the potential for updates every 3rd year after the full stock assessment, after MSC reconditioning and any investigations. And then the commission can potentially update the harvest strategy policy document. So we put that on a potential 3-year period.
First time you find out it doesn't work.
Yep.
That's updated.
Yeah. But in this process, that really should be within a 3-year time period based on exceptional circumstances, unless something really goes outside the box. So that's the schedule of events. Any suggestions on that would be appreciated. And we'll go over this with the commission as well and see if they have any suggestions as well. Okay, the last item, which is a few slides, is a SRB request. This is actually a request, data request. I've put in the request here, and my apologies, there's some text here that got brought in when I copied it from headers. So I'll read it out. Noting that definitions of overfish and overfishing are consistent with the use of these terms in the USA federal fishery management systems under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, but differ from the terms and definitions elsewhere. The SRB requested a broader investigating of terms and definitions related to biomass and F reference points used by fishery management organizations throughout the world. So I've done a little bit of investigation on this, and I just want to walk through some of these different management organizations and their concepts. So first in Canada, we have the Fisheries Act, and please correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. I'm not an expert on any of these.
I don't recommend using. Go ahead.
So they have the Fisheries Act where, and I've just sort of pulled out statements that I thought were useful in understanding overfishing and overfishing. The minister shall implement measures to maintain major fish stocks at or above level necessary to promote sustainability, taking into account biology and the environmental conditions affecting the stock. That's in the act. And the way that Canada works is they have this harvest control rule in the figure here where they have a critical zone, It's below about, you don't want to be there. It's below some level of stock status. They have a cautious zone. You want to be cautious and reduce fishing mortality, and then a healthy zone. And what you'll notice is this horizontal and then slanted sloping line are the fishing rate, removal rate, they call it. And then this vertical line, which is numbered 4, is actually the target reference point, noting that that's above the line between the cautious and healthy zone. And I actually like that because you want to fluctuate around your target point. The lines here delineating critical, cautious, and healthy are defined by BMSY, being 40% BMSY and 80% BMSY. And the removal reference is based on FMSY. So F level that would achieve MSY. They have a number of proxies if you can't estimate MSY. And then overfishing and overfished are actually not mentioned in what I have seen from Canada, but I think, so I couldn't find any. What's that?
Correct.
Okay. So that's a really brief summary of Canada, just getting the big pictures of all these. In the USA, we have the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation Management Act. And that's been under a couple of revisions and amendments, or national standards included. But it has statements like conservation management measures shall prevent overfishing while achieving on a continuing basis the optimum yield from each fishery. And then some other statements for those fisheries managed under a fishery management plan or international agreement. The status shall be determined using the criteria for overfishing specified in such plan or agreement. So that states there's fishery management plans or other strategy policies. And a fishery shall be classified as approaching a condition of being overfished if, a bunch of other words, the secretary estimates that the fishery will become overfished within 2 years. So it's interesting. I don't see that used that often. But I'll show you in Alaska, it's sort of used in Alaska. Yeah. So I found, well, that's interesting because, that's how I've been thinking of overfishing. Are you fishing now in a way that's going to result in it being overfished in the future?
Which is F greater than FMSY.
Not necessarily. Because if you're fishing down the stock, if you're starting at unfished stock, you can fish higher than FMSY for a couple of years and still fish. I have experience with orange roughy fisheries, so.
But in the US, that would be illegal.
Yes, so that's the key. In Canada, the removal rates based on FMSY. And so let's look at a couple of fishery management plans that I'm familiar with on the West Coast. Not familiar with the East Coast. I've looked at a few over there. But on the West Coast, so the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, which deals with Alaskan waters. Here's a couple of excerpts from the Bering Sea Aleutian Islands Fishery Management Plan. So they have a maximum fishing mortality threshold, or MFMT. They love their acronyms. Also called the OFL control rule. So really it's an OFL. Level of fishing mortality on an annual basis used to compute the smallest annual level of catch that would constitute overfishing. Overfishing occurs whenever a stock or stock complex is subject to a level of fishing mortality or annual total catch that jeopardizes the capacity of the stock to produce MSY on a continuing basis. Here is linking it to MSY. Overfishing limit OFL is the annual amount of catch that results from applying the MFMT, which is basically FMSY, to a stock or stock complex's abundance. The OFL is the catch level above which overfishing is occurring. So you cannot exceed the OFL, overfishing is declared. There's a tier system in this that accounts for uncertainty about estimation of MSY and all those other things. I won't go into that. But they have some definitions of overfishing, overfished, and then they have a definition of approaching overfished. So overfishing is the catch exceeds the OFL, or FMSY basically. Overfished is if it's below the minimum stock size threshold. That's right. And MSST is defined as being 1/2 MSY. But BMSY. Yep. Thank you. And but if no estimate of BMSY they have proxies, and that's basically a B 35% for OFL and 40% for ABC. We won't get into ABC stuff here. Now, what's interesting is they have this concept of approaching overfish, and is they do projections and to see if at a specific, is it an F rate or is that a specific F rate or a specific OFL over the next 2 years? Like, no, it's the max ABC or something. So I think they calculate the mortality, the catch from the F, and I'm speculating here, but they basically do projections to see if the stock would be classified as overfished in 2 years. And then it gets even more complicated. There's a method that they do a 12-year projection. And if at the end of 12 years, it's somewhere, they claim that it could be overfished. Still figure that one out. But there is, I think if it's within like what that Canada calls the cautious zone, then they'll do projections to see if it could be overfished at these levels. So it's pretty interesting process. So anyways, that's what the North Pacific Fishery Management Council does. So they have specific definitions of overfishing and overfished and approaching overfished. The Pacific Fishery Management Council on the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington, they have some definitions. Overfished describes any stock whose size is sufficiently diminished that a change in management practices is required to achieve an appropriate level and rate of rebuilding. The default proxy is generally 25% of estimated unfished biomass. However, other scientifically valued values are also authorized. In 2009, I was involved with the council and the SSC at this council in redefining the flatfish overfished level, and it's currently defined at 12.5%. So for flatfish, their overfish definition is 12.5%. B0. Yeah, and that's a static B0. Overfishing means exceeding an OFL specified in regulations, which the OFL is the MSY harvest level. So again, this is similar, an FMSY rate. If you exceed over the OFL, it's defined as overfishing. But the Pacific Council, as far as I'm aware, does not have any sort of approaching overfished or projections. I'm almost done here. I threw in New Zealand because I was a little bit familiar with that. I was involved when they initially started defining their harvest strategy with Pamela Mace coming down there. And they have what's called a harvest strategy standard for New Zealand fisheries. They also have a separate document, which is operational guidelines. But in the standard, they have overfished stocks that are below biomass limit, such as what they call a soft limit, and are frequently referred to as overfished. However, the term depleted should generally be used in preference to overfished because stocks can become depleted through a combination of overfishing and environmental factors.
Recognize Pamela's voice there.
Yeah, yeah. So, and it's usually impossible to separate the two. So we're actually attempting to separate those in terms of this dynamic B0 approach. And then their overfishing is also relative to an FMSY or relevant proxy. Is exceeded. I don't know what they mean by on average there, but it's, again, overfishing is based on an FMSY concept as well. So a lot of similarities between these. One, overfishing is really based on MSY and FMSY, and then slightly different definitions of overfished. So what should we do here? This is the proposal to put in the harvest strategy policy, which we want to work with the SRB and with the commissioners on as well. So overfished is currently specified, and that's in the black Times Roman font, when the estimated probability that coastwide female relative spawning stock biomass is below the limit reference point, RSB 20%, is greater than 50%. And that is calculated using current stock and environmental conditions, because that's the dynamic B0. So that is currently proposed overfish definition. Overfishing, we had some text in there that says time frame and probability to be determined. So we've now inserted some specific text on time frame and probability. And this is where the stock is subject to a level of fishing that would move it to an overfished state with a greater than 50% probability, or prevent it from rebuilding to a not overfished state with a less than 70% probability. So it's, are you coming down at it or are you coming up at it? If you're coming up at it, you want to be really certain. Within 3 years, that's the time frame. And that 3 years is, I mean, we just proposed that because that's the projection period that the stock assessment will use. The level of fishing is defined as a fixed mortality and biomass applied to all 3 years. So the reason we're proposing this is now it's very consistent with the decision table. And the decision table could actually be used to define the overfishing level. And so I'll show you how that could be done. And so this is getting at if the stock is large, or for some reason, you know, it's just at a high level, management may want to fish it down and exceed FMSY to achieve optimal yield, whatever yield is defined as. And we thought a 3-year period with a consistent mortality would offer a little bit of caution there instead of a 1 year or 2 year period. It spreads it out a little bit more, and it says if you fish at this level for 3 consistent years, and you know it's going to drive the stock down, you know, more than a 2 year period. So we thought that would be ensure that a single year is not too excessive, especially since an FMSY rate could be exceeded. So that's our proposal, and then I'll show you how this could be used in the decision table. Sorry, it's a bit small. But basically there's this section here on stock status, and this is the 3-year projection. And this row now is that 3-year projection is less than 20%. And this is the actual decision table from the 2024 stock assessment. And so you can see there's a 21% probability or chance that the stock would be less than 20%, harvesting at 53.2 million pound TCUI. So the decision the commission made, which was 20, was more along this level, was definitely not be classified as overfishing. So with that, that's the end of this presentation. And you know, you're very good at coming up with recommendations. I'll leave it here for now. That was the last thing we covered. And yeah, really succinct today, and make sure we had time for the assessment.
Well, I appreciate all the review. That was helpful. It was good to see them all compared against one another. I think it just shows that it's they've completely perverted the whole idea of both fish and overfishing. Its original definition. I think the idea of
Definition laid out in stone.
well, I mean, there's a theory. We have theories for a reason. And if you want to call it something different, then call it something different. You give it a different name, but you know, like overfished can mean anything.
Yeah.
Because you can pick an arbitrary whatever limit biomass or whatever. I like the depleted one because that more accurately describes what you need. You're talking about something where you need to take some fairly drastic action. In that case, stock is, and I think that's the spirit of the Canadian one, is they called it, critical.
Yeah.
To give it that gravitas that it needs.
One thing we wanted with the term overfished, well, overfished and overfishing, there's a lot of expectations of these certification agencies to use these terms.
Yeah, but which one are they going to use?
And that's the
thing.
And so given that we are using overfished in this harvest strategy policy, and that's, up for debate what we want to use, call it. But if we are going to call it overfished, I'm really in support of the dynamic calculation of biomass because you can be overfished without fishing. then that's. Then
It can be
really
depleted. I think
Exactly.
that's the New Zealand,
Yeah.
is that the stock can be depleted, in which case it's not your fault, but it's depleted and you probably can't go fishing or whatever.
Right.
You gotta seriously cut back on fishing because
Yeah.
any additional mortalities. Yeah. So that takes that overfish thing away.
Yeah.
In that situation. Well, I was gonna say, there's inconsistency between overfish and overfishing in that, you know, in the theory, if you're overfishing, you will eventually become overfished.
Yep.
Which does not happen in any of these definitions.
Right.
Like here, in this overfishing, where the stock is subject to a level of mortality, move it to an overfish state, which is 50% of, you know, BMSY. That would be, you know, a fishing mortality that's really high, like one you would almost never see.
Mhm.
So this might not even, it may be toothless.
I did look at decision tables from the past, and the highest mortality levels in all the decision tables would never have been overfishing.
My concern about this is with respect to the probabilistic framework there, and consistency with the precautionary principle. So in some future where you've got really poor information and your confidence intervals are really wide, could it be the case that the threshold for having a greater than 50% probability becomes so high because your confidence intervals are like this? So, and that runs counter to the precautionary principle, right? Where if you don't know, you back off. In this case, uncertainty could lead to not declaring overfishing. What's actually occurring? Because you just can't tell.
Right.
That's not I don't think that's completely a very big concern. But ideally, these are definitions that can last long into the future, into many different uncertain futures, right?
Yeah, I mean, we could deal with that by changing the 50% different threshold or a different level, 5%, whatever. Yeah.
But I think the way to deal with that is evaluating some scenarios where you can have more assessment performance in the future.
Okay.
Just arbitrarily increasing the uncertainties of the assessments, seeing whether this definition lets you end up with hidden overfishing. Is the assessment is less accurate.
I mean, that's a good point, is to evaluate these some ways. You often you get it wrong on what the risk is. So Sean, you mentioned, you know, higher than like an MSY fishing rate would eventually result in overfish state. And to me, that's the time frame in the overfishing definition, where here we're defining it at 3 years. When you think of a overfishing definition based on FMSY, is basically increasing that time frame to an infinite number of years.
True. the expectation, the long-term expectation is that I think that's another idea, like probably another reason why the Canadian, so the reason behind the zones, which it is like you can then say, okay, you're allowed to you're allowed to be overfishing in the healthy zone. Like the Atlantic halibut harvest control rule allows you to fish at greater than FMSY when you're well above BMSY. As soon as you get down, I forget what the level is, but you get, I think it's within 20% of BMSY. Now you can't fish more than that.
Okay,
That's the way the harvest control rule works. We don't actually.
so it's a little different than the figure I showed. That figure,
Yeah.
the removal rate.
The problem with that figure is that you've got a harvest control rule overlapped on a set of objectives. And you could have any harvest control rule. We have such a diversity of fisheries that a standard hockey stick harvest control rule doesn't apply. You can't do that.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of conflating those two things. The idea is that the things that you want to do is avoid the critical zone and stay around the healthy zone. That's really what you're trying to do, right?
Should we maybe take a little break and then back to this? or-
Yeah, we could take our break till 11.
Sure.
Anytime.
Yeah, we're ahead of schedule right now.
We could debate on fishing or fishing for 2 more hours if you want.
I don't know if I have the energy today. but Maybe another hour.
All right, so we're just gonna break till 11 o'clock, all those listening in tonight.
Do you want to move on to the next agenda item then, or just?
I think so. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Maybe just a quick discussion around that previous request or recommendation from the SRB about meeting with the commission to sort of go through some of these
Oh, right.
changes. Is that something you'd still like to do? And if so, noting that the commission does have a second tentative workshop intended on being undertaken, whether it's before the work meeting or during, is there a time you think you'd be available in particular that we could put into the record just so the commission's aware?
Do you have possible dates for a workshop?
Oh, yeah.
Months?
I'm not available the last week in August. And then September. So we really want to do this before the work meeting.
I think so, and that way you'll have a chance to finalize anything strategy policy or
Yeah.
the work meeting before.
Yeah, so, I mean, after July 7th, I'm wide open till August 19th.
So it would have to be August for me. But any time between August 1st and 19th is fine.
Okay, so we can include that as just an indication that, you're willing to do that. That's part of all this, and we'll try and tee it up, communicate the SRB's thoughts, some of these key points. Okay. Anything else you can think of?
No, not at this point. I think sort of the plan here is to have, at the work meeting, a draft harbor strategy policy. And then the commission will be considering that for adoption late fall, hopefully. So we can provide that at SRB027 in September. Other than that, pretty exciting time. Yep.
Nothing else. Can we just have up the presentation for Dr. Webster, please?
You want to use? Use. You can, it might be a little easier. It's that.
Oh, okay, so, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
That
so you
sounds
can
good.
just use the
Okay.
mouse to.
Thank you.
First.
Good morning. This is the annual presentation to the SRB of the FIST design evaluation. I think this might be the second year in which we've attempted to present preliminary cost evaluation, including cost evaluation for the SRB, following a request to see designs that are perhaps more likely to go ahead in these times of challenges in terms of affording the cost of desired design. So I'll emphasize this in many points. Any cost information you see here is extremely preliminary and is likely to change maybe by quite a lot by the time that we have clear information from current FIS. So background, FIS most important source of data on Pacific halibut provides data for estimating our indices of density and abundance, which we use to estimate stock trends, distribution, and as an input into the stock assessment. Provides biological data for the assessment. We've had an annual FIS since 1993. The design was expanded in those initial years to include sampling in all regulatory areas, and then further expanded more recently to include sampling in previously unsampled waters, including deeper waters, shallow waters, and various gaps in the survey design. This led us to a full grid of 1,890 stations on a 10 by 10 nautical mile grid throughout most of the range, and we sampled Bering Sea twice in 2005 and 2016, 2006 and 2015, which allowed us to devise a calibration between this design and troll survey that's undertaken annually in the Bering Sea. So we use the troll data, calibrated troll data for that big area in red that we can't sample each year. The full FIS grid cannot be sampled each year for logistical reasons. It's challenging and cost prohibitive. So ideally we're prioritizing sampling based on scientific needs as the first priority. Precise estimates of the intensity and abundance indices in the stock distribution with low potential for bias, which would necessitate more frequent sampling in areas with higher variability. And I didn't update this one. And this second objective was long-term revenue neutrality. So see in the next slide that has been revised. It was revised at the annual meeting. Means we might need to increase effort in revenue positive areas to offset the cost of sampling low density habitat, potentially reduce effort in high cost areas to avoid large deficits. And we've been doing both of these things in recent years in order to make a more cost effective survey, and which is what that objective has been modified to. So you notice in this list of objectives, which we've shown every year for the last several years to the SRB and at every meeting. The secondary objective was revised at the annual meeting this year to replace long-term revenue neutrality with cost effectiveness. So without compromising the scientific integrity of the FIS design, it includes logistics, costs, scientific integrity, operational feasibility, cost revenue, and scientific needs, with an aspirational target reserve of $2 million. And so I unfortunately missed the annual meeting, so I was not there for the discussions regarding this change, but it is in the report, and see we're at the meeting. So if you want more information on this, I guess this is a more flexible definition than in the revenue neutrality definition. Otherwise, primary objective is scientific, tertiary objectives are other ancillary things. The process for design review remains pretty much unchanged since previous meetings. We're in that design preparation stage up until now, which is the first review outside the Secretariat with the SRB with preliminary costs. And then based on what your requests and recommendations might be, we may do further design work, further refinement of designs or further analysis of the designs that we proposed or put forward for discussion. And then we'll get input throughout the year on from the stakeholders. It's the yellow boxes. When the FIS is being undertaken, we get input from the charter vessel staff, skippers, and folks that we interact with in the ports. And then the commissioner will see a first cut of revision of the designs you're seeing today based on updated costs from the FIS as we can before the September work meeting, and with the goal for decision at the interim meeting, and usually late November, early December. Then maybe adjustments subsequent to that. So we are here in the Green Circle. So some background on recent FIS designs. Following the expansion last decade, we rationalized the FIS, basically devising a way forward, given that we're not able to sample every station every year. And we came up with a design that was based on random sampling in the core of the stock, 2B, 2C, 3A, and 3B, and sampling blocks of stations elsewhere prioritized to maintain precise estimates with low bias, given that random sampling is less efficient in the limits of the stock where things are much more expensive. And that design was approved. Unfortunately, COVID showed up, and we were only able to sample core areas in 2019, somewhat reduced in those areas. In subsequent years, the proposed design was largely implemented. We did not get, with exceptions in Western 4B, due to lack of viable bids. And 23 to 25, we've been sampling reduced designs implemented to lower costs. We've had little sampling outside the core areas in 2023, with no FIS sampling in 4A, 4B, or 4CDE. Further reductions in 3A and 3B were made in 2024. There was some sampling in 4CDE. 2025, we have sampling in 3A and 3B, complementary to the sampling to the previous 2 years, and sampling higher density parts of 2A and 4A, 4B for the first time since 2022. And Ian showed this figure yesterday. As mentioned, it was a request for the RAB, and I think it's quite an effective figure, showing how long it's been since we've sampled some of these areas. And the darker the color, the further back in time it has been since we've sampled. So yellow was sampled last year, and orange within the last 2 years. But further back, you can see here particularly parts of 2A, 4A, and 4B have not been sampled for several years. Some of these areas will remain unsampled in 2025, and so it's been 6 or more years since some of these areas have been sampled. So we're losing our understanding of what's going on in these areas. We're unable to track the trend. The variances are increasing in our estimates from the space-time modeling, and we're getting increasing uncertainty in our indices of density and stock distribution, particularly out west. The planned 2025 design, this is not exactly the design approved by the commissioners, but it's very close. So we have sampling in the core part of 2A, in the highest density parts in Washington and the central Oregon coast. We have charter regions in the north of 2B and south of 2C. These are expected to be our revenue positive regions. We're sampling the central part of 3A. It's not necessarily the highest density part of 3A, but as noted, it's an area in 3A. These are charter regions in 3A. that we didn't sample in the last couple of years. So the commission prioritized those to get information, fill an information gap in still what is still the largest part of the stock. And likewise for Western 3B, a couple of charter regions that we have sampled in recent years, even if those were likely to lose more money than other parts of 3B, filling in gaps in our knowledge from those couple of years. And sampling in 4A, the highest density parts of 4A and 4B. You notice that the 4B design is quite compact, and the 4A design is a lot gappier, and that was a process of negotiation. It's not ideal, but the only bid we could get, I think, for this to proceed was from a bidder who did not feel comfortable sampling some of those deeper waters in 4A, did not have the experience or the confidence to fish those effectively. So we have a design that's basically a negotiated design where they're fishing the stations that they feel comfortable with. So there's a potential for bias within that design, but we're still getting data from 4A, which is better than otherwise have had, where that this not be available to us. And we expect a comprehensive, I think, what are we expecting from the next survey this year? They're doing Northern Bearings here. Yeah, so a comprehensive design for 2025. Noting that they are, again, they are undertaking revisions to their design and working on some calibration studies, new design to the current design, and we will have to account for that in our future designs, either through calibrating through their second order calibration, essentially, or consider if we have the resources, sampling that area again to do a more direct calibration. Potential designs for 2026 to 2028. Everything else we've seen so far is done. There's nothing say to influence what's happening in 2025 anymore, but for 2026, which is our main focus from now on. So until last year, initial designs targeted a random selection of stations in the core. This method for station selection was chosen in 2019 of a proposal to fish charter regions as blocks, and we kind of circle the last couple of years where the commission are now recommending we do. They reevaluated potential block designs in 2023 last year. So having a more compact design, maybe with larger gaps, not being able to sample all blocks every year, should reduce the cost of sampling, maybe hopefully lead to lower bids due to greater operational efficiency, fishing stations close to each other. So yeah, as mentioned, that what we came up with was we had three possible designs, and the one that is sort of the optimal design as far as we're concerned for keeping bias potential low, while still leading precise estimates, is what we call the base block design, which we evaluated for commission consideration. Prioritizes some annual sampling in each biological region for stock assessment purposes, ensures all charter regions in the core of the stock are sampled over a 3-year period. And coverage in other areas is prioritized to minimize bias potential and maintain CVs below 25% in each regulatory area. Sample blocks are charter regions in the core of the stock, and these are rotated over time. So while we can see fairly large changes from 1 year to the next by rotating designs and sampling over a 2 to 3 year, sampling every station over a 2 to 3 year period, we reduce the potential for missing large changes due to lack of sample. Okay, so this these are revised from last year based on the new designs that we've fished in 2025. So slight revision of priorities, but essentially the same design overall. That we're fishing half the charter regions in 3A and 2 out of 5 in 3B, 2 out of 3 in 2C, and 2 out of 4 of the main charter regions in 2B each year. And then the other Sampling is rotated in areas 4B, 4CD, 2A. 2A would be sampled every other year, with the higher density areas sample more frequency than the low density areas. We have this high density areas in 2A targeted 2027, as they are this year, in the lower density areas 2028. And so for 2026, the base block design includes sampling all of the eastern part of 4B. Some of that is being sampled this year, a relatively small part of it, less than half of it. That is the highest density part of 4B, and we haven't had comprehensive sampling there for quite some time. 4A, we're prioritizing sampling the southeastern part of 4A, which has not been sampled by us at all since 2019. We're actually proposing not sampling 4A in 2027, but we have sampling in biological region 4 via the 4CD edge. And of course, celebrated in its full celebration. And we have another stab at trying to sample western part of 4B, which we last had targeted sampling in 2022, and we have no viable builds. That's one still. So we expect to be a difficult one to get betters for even 2 years from now, unless things change. 2028, most of this is just a rotation of filling it, sampling what we haven't sampled, with a small number of stations each year in 4B, block of 30 stations in eastern 4B to ensure that we have some sampling in their biological region each year. So this is very similar to what you were presented with last year, with some modifications based on prioritizing charter regions that we are not sampling stock. So with that design, the base block design is expected to maintain coefficients of variation below 25% in each of the next 3 years. These coefficients of variation are the terminal year coefficients of variation. So the 2026 coefficient of variation is what we expect at completion of the 2026 survey. The terminal year is the most imprecisely estimated, and that's the one that's used for management decisions in that year. So it's most relevant to look at the CVs for that year, and rather than say the CV for 2026 as estimated in 2027 towards the improvement. So this still leads to precise estimates, relatively precise estimates at the regulatory area, particularly in the core of the stock with CVs of 15% or less, and by biological region, CVs of 10% or less, except for regulatory area, biological region 4B, and coast-wide CVs of around 4% in each year. And with bias maintained low because of the high frequency of sampling. So this is an enlargement of the same figure you just saw before for the 2026 base block design. Preliminary projected net revenue is minus $1.8 million. That is very preliminary, largely based on the numbers for prices and costs from the 2024 FIS. The prices we're seeing from the IFQ fishery so far this year are substantially better. 30% or more better. So something like that would lead to quite different designs. Not for this, but could improve the projected revenue per design like this. Minus 1.2 million. But that's yet to unfold. I don't know if we've made our first FIS. I think we've made our first FIS sales, but I haven't seen all those prices. But it's still really, even from first sales, it'd be too early to see how it's going to flow into the cost projections next year. Just summarizing the evaluation of the base block design, projected terminal year CVs 25% or less in regulatory area, less than 10% the biological region. So the design is expected to maintain precise estimates with a low risk of bias because of its rotating nature of the short period. But because of the substantial projected operating loss, at least at this stage, it would require a lot of supplementary funding for it to be considered cost effective and meet our secondary objective. So therefore, we developed an alternative design with a more feasible preliminary projected net operating loss of close to $0.5 million. The kind of thing we might expect to be able to, the commissioners to feel comfortable funding from reserves or maybe securing a modest amount of supplementary. This reduced loss design includes revenue positive charter regions and IPHC regulatory areas 2B and 2C, one charter region each. 3 other charter regions, one in each of IPHC's regulatory areas 2B, 2C, and 3A. 30 stations subsample per region, around 53 to 58% of the stations per region. The reasoning there is that that slightly reduces the loss by subsampling those charter regions rather than completely sampling them, because they are somewhat loss-making regions. And those 3 charter regions in particular prioritized as they were among the regions not sampled in the most recent 1 to 2 years. So we're trying to do some complementary sampling, even if those maybe aren't the ones that maybe we would lose a little less money if we picked slightly different regions. And it looks like this. So it looks great in 2B and 2C. It doesn't look very good anywhere else. And that's that cluster of 30 stations in 3. That's for illustrative purposes only. I was trying to keep it compact there, but the exact design were we to go forward with something like this, and need not look like that. Likewise, the stations of west coast of Vancouver Island and BC, it's another compact set of 30 stations. The ultimate design might not look like that. It's just for, and the north of that, Goose Island, I think, area, just for illustrative purposes. So the projected loss at this point is minus $500,000. So close to that $500,000 range we're looking at. So this design has limited spatial coverage and leads to increased risk of bias relative to the base block design, particularly considering that we've had reduced designs over the last couple of years. So some of these areas, particularly out west, have already increasing risks of bias through lack of sampling. So it's great. There's a greater risk that important stock changes will remain unobserved. Space-time model estimates for unsampled regions will begin to drift towards the long-term mean in the absence of data. And in the case of the areas out west, the long-term mean is quite a bit higher than what we're seeing right now. We'll get increased uncertainty in estimates of the density indices, and the assessment model will therefore rely more heavily on the commercial index, as it did in 2023. It'll be unclear if the assessment model will be able to detect a major change in year class abundance due to the current spatial variability and uncertainty in the magnitude of younger year classes, and limited biological information from biological region 3 in the stock score. And limit is a bit of an understatement, perhaps. So we've also developed intermediate designs, the kind of thing we might look at if cost projections become more optimistic and we have more money available, or there becomes a strong desire to not go all the way down to the reduced loss design, and commissioners find some other way of funding things. So together with the reduced loss, which we're calling now option 1, and the base block option 7, these designs comprise 7 preliminary FIST design options for 2026. So preliminary option 2, I jumped ahead a slide. Preliminary option 2 is simply that those regions, those charter regions where we're sampling 30 stations, we sample the whole charter region instead. So reducing that potential for local bias, at least at that charter region level. And the difference is only $20,000, the kind of amount that's kind of in the noise of these estimates anyway. So essentially the same design, but with expansion within those charter regions. You can see that the block in 3A now is the entire charter region. Likewise, off coast of Vancouver. So, option 3, add sampling in IPHC regulatory area 4B to option 2. So that's that entire part of the proposal from the base block design and regulatory area 4B. That ensures that we now have sampling in all biological regions if we account, if we include the sampling that the NIMS control survey will be doing in region 4. So that's why we're prioritizing that, even though it's losing quite a bit more money in the order of $300,000. Preliminary option 4 adds a charter region IPHC regulatory area 3B to have more greater spatial coverage in regulatory area and biological region 3. Option 5 adds back from the base block design the charter region, the sub area 4A that we had prioritized since it had not been sampled since 2019. Now the loss is over $1 million. Option 6 includes all stations in the base block design together with 3 revenue positive regions in biological region 2 that were not part of the base block. Base block design did not make priorities based on whether a region was going to earn revenue or not. And so option 7 was the base block design, which then takes out those regions, those revenue positive regions that would otherwise not have been prioritized except revenue benefits. And that was around $1.8 million, if you recall. Here they all are summarized with the numbers of charter regions in the second column in parentheses. So the designs were also optimized for the number of skates with 4, 6, or 8 skates used. Different parts of the stock are cost optimized, different numbers of skates. Tend to maximize the number of skates where we make the most money and reduce the number of skates where we're likely to lose money. And it depends on projected catch rates and bait costs, which can also affect the optimal number of skates. 2025 Pacific halibut price and landings assumed not to change from the values realized in 2024, and I've already mentioned that. So far, prices are looking a lot better in 2025 than these projections are assuming. If they really are up by 30%, then we can entertain a much more flexible set of realistic designs than we've seen here. As I mentioned, the costs are largely based on information from the 2024 FIS and the outcomes of the 2025 bidding process. And it's important to note the high uncertainty in the catch cost projections of 26 this far in advance. Final cost and accounting information will be available at the end of the 2025 fiscal year and will be used to refine these projections at that time. Okay. So as with the designs we adopted over the last 2 years, the 2026 reduced loss design was result in less information available for the annual stock assessment and management supporting calculations, such as stock distribution, than we got in years prior to 2024. In addition to the points previously outlined, the basic stock assessment methods can remain unchanged, but a greater proportion of the uncertainty in stock change demographics will not be quantified due to missing FIS data from a large proportion of the range. Implications for the assessment would be of increasing concern if we continue fishing designs like the reduced loss design. So we've had multiple years now with reduced designs similar to this. Not quite as bad as this, but certainly reduced in scope from what we desire based on our scientific priorities. And these designs result in reduced stakeholder confidence in the FIS results. And this is coming up. It's come up in the last 2 annual meetings. Stakeholders are generally very supportive of a strong representative FIS design, and it's of increasing concern to the stakeholders that these designs are being reduced and perhaps undermining in their eyes the integrity of the information that's feeding into the assessment. And we again emphasize the preliminary nature of all of these projections. This is only the second year we've presented this to the SRB, and we do it with a bit of trepidation because things can change a lot over this time. But you understand the importance of you seeing designs that are perhaps more realistic than just seeing the base block design and realizing that no one's ever going to implement that this year because it's just cost prohibitive. So we will present you with the revised designs in September, and you'll have another chance to weigh in on those, and hoping you're going to be a little more spatially extensive than that's presented here. That's to be seen. So the note at this stage is simply the recommendation is simply that you note the paper which presents the design's options, including a preliminary option for reduced loss design, accounting for the secondary for subjective cost effectiveness. Now, not very seamless, but I don't know if you want to. These were all estimated with the space-time model. I don't know if you want to talk about that now, Ola, or should we discuss the designs? So there is work on that I intend to present in September on updates to the space-time modeling, which includes some applications of maturity data. So, but I think you had some questions on that from yesterday as well. So anyway, that's the end of my presentation. So I'll leave it to you how you want to steer the discussion.
I didn't see, is this available for ones other than the base block for the reduced distance?
This, no. And there's a lot of work that goes into producing these.
Okay.
And it's a couple of weeks of running analyses. I've got to run all the models, and it's a regulatory area by regulatory area process, and I've got to run it 3 times, one for each year, so we can get those terminal years. So given how preliminary those designs are, to do a full evaluation of all the other designs was not feasible with the time frame for the SRB.
Sure.
So it's worth doing something. You talked about it yesterday. It's worth doing something like this for a design like were the reduced loss design be the one that the commissioners end up seeing in September as our sort of cost-effective design, then an analysis like this would be useful. Until then, I'm holding off on plowing through all of that.
That seems reasonable. I just would worry about them seeing a cheap price tag without seeing the cost in terms of CVs.
So we do talk about the cost in those sort of wordy terms, and we have tried to present things in the past where we look at the potential for bias, show how the time series could drift up and down based on the amount of change we've seen in a short time frame in the past. And so we'll add some emphasis through those discussions, but I haven't generally presented this, but we'll see as the season progresses what's looking to be the kind of thing that they might see in September, and then I can work through that, at least especially the 2026, 27, 28. There's so much uncertainty in the landscape.
Yeah.
And then, as you talked about yesterday, doing something with this with stock distribution, it's not actually something we've done. It's spat out of the analysis, but I haven't processed it. So we could get CVs to stock distribution to come up with something similar to the table that been presented at the annual meeting this year, so they can get uncertainty in the review.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful when you're carrying it through to the TC class.
We brought this up before. Is it time to revisit cost neutrality?
Well, that's what they've done.
Yeah, so the commission have changed their objective. They've eliminated neutrality. It's their primary objective. So Greg, it's about to put it up on the screen, the new validity. Sorry, which one is it now? It's the secondary.
Yeah, cost effectiveness.
No, compromising.
I know it sounds a little more, to me, it sounds a bit more wishy-washy, but but I think it allows them to make a loss more. I don't know, the end with their.
I think you're grappling with the same thing we had in
Okay.
terms of what they're trying to achieve. They just want more flexibility. But they have agreed that revenue neutrality can no longer be maintained in the current environment.
I guess this would encompass the desire to have that $2 million pot of money if we can secure that from federal sources, or some other way of while making operational losses.
Does the target reserve have to do with the survey? You're not gonna raise that survey. A number of ways. So part of it would hopefully come from the survey time. And for example, if we look back at 2019, we were revenue positive $900,000. So it can happen if certain other elements track in our favor. But the other way is through multiple funding sources, whether it be typical federal sources or in alternative means. And we're going through that process at the moment, trying to work with industry to see if there are other means to raise funds for this or to reduce costs for this.
How many licenses? Would it be like a license?
That was broached as something, but the problem is they already have a cost recovery fee. Alaska, for example, that we already use a portion of to fund the port.
We talk about the FaceTime model.
Sure. So see this, I was staring at that yesterday. Parse it out without any context, much context. So I'll tell you what I've been working on. For quite a while, and it's all related to this maturity and there's this as well. So I've been trying to work up a way of doing a coast-wide modeling. I wanted to make it more efficient instead of fitting area by area as I am doing. And so this year I know you're probably aware that the first steps for this is you have to come up with a map which you're modeling over a mesh of some kind. And that wasn't necessarily super straightforward at the coastwide level, because once you put all the areas together, you want a mesh that has a fine enough scale that's capturing the kind of spatial correlation that we're observing, the degree of spatial correlation we're observing, but isn't so fine that the whole thing crashes under its own weight, and you can't fit models, or you can't, in some cases, you can't even produce the mesh. And we have an intricate coastline, and it's quite unique to most analysts who are doing this analyses, who are trying to do this kind of modeling, where they're using a much smaller area usually, which they're analyzing it. So when you have intricate coastlines, you have to account for that in your mesh, and you have more loads and so on, and the size of the thing blows up very quickly. So anyway, I've come up with something that I think works. I tend to show it to you in September. And so I've been using the maturity data set as a test data set on this mesh, because it's much smaller than the FIS. We have like 3,600, 3,200, I can't remember, fish sample.
Over all years.
Overall, yeah, so I'm starting with a spatial model, and then I can work to build up to a spatial temple. And then allowing the model to have different parameters for, in this case, biological regions. So we can have some spatial variation in some of the model parameters, but also considering models which have random effects in the parameters. You've got generalized additive mixed effects model up there. So something like that is the goal. So I've looked at, started off with just a generalized linear model, where we basically have the relationship with age as linear on the logit scale, and allow those parameters to vary biological region, but have the residual being a spatially autocorrelated residual. So it's not so different from what we're doing with this. But then I also am looking at models where, well, we have a generalized linear model, but the slope and the intercept are now spatially correlated. So essentially you can then get a map of the intercept and the slope across the entire region, or you can combine them to get a 50 value. Got some pretty maps that I've shown. Looks nice, and makes a lot of sense relating it to what we've seen so far. But very simple preliminary models. And I'm trying to move towards a GAM model, and I'm using RNLA, and I see references in some places to GAM models in RNLA. It's not being most of the reference material is not on the website, how you can fit, say, smoothing splines or something along those lines. But somebody's trying to sell you a 700-pound course, fitting gams and those things would pay up for that. So anyway, I'm working in that direction, but I've tried fitting some simple, flexible models of the type that I've done before. So a random walk, a model with age. So just trying to give a variance parameter. It allows us to essentially move from one age to the other, and that has more flexibility. There's some limits in how ideally you have the random walk tuning parameter that's sigma varying spatially, but it doesn't seem to be a way of doing that. So you make it vary by region. And, so that seems to be some of the deviation from the generalized linear model. Recall there's a little bit of wiggliness in the lines, which is why we're using the GAM. Anyway, that's the direction I'm trying to go.
And I think the main reason for the gap was not the wiggliness at the high end, but the unrealistic behavior at the low end.
It's a bit of both. Yeah. There is, so the GAM will tighten things up at the low end, make the drop steeper, more realistic. So less the difference between truncated and non-truncated models ultimately don't seem to matter. But also at the high end, it doesn't necessarily asymptote to one. There's still a lot of the data we have, or at least we don't have that many older fish, but there's still immature fish at age 25. And so whereas the GLM is supposed to asymptote, and it will do that. So it's a bit of both ends and a little bit of non-smoothness in the middle. So I've tried to do sort of a blended model where I have these very a GLM with spatially varying slope and intercept, but then add a random walk component to it to allow them flexibility. And so that's working within the constraints of what I see with the software at the moment. So I think we can do something, but it looks like there's potential for doing more as well, possibly with GAMs. But I see references to GAM-like models, so it may be, it's not going to be exact. Spatially explicit GAM kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's where we're.
Well, I think that's fine. I mean, there's nothing about the GAM.
No, yeah.
Just want to be able to be flexible.
Yeah.
So that our model will
Yeah,
allow-
exactly. Yeah, so it's my intention to write that up and present something.
Fantastic. That seems like a great solution to this issue of either being able to do the weighting based on abundance or account for the sampling.
Yeah. So in this case, exactly. So in this case, I've come up with coast-wide estimates, and instead of I'm doing what I'm doing at this and predicting at each of our 1,890 stations plus the troll grid, and so then it's more like a direct average across those stations, including the areas with high uncertainty where we don't have any direct estimates. So that's going to bring in that uncertainty, which is going to really be accounted for. Weighting by NPUE at individual station regional values.
Sounds great. Thanks for explaining.
No worries. Thanks for asking that.
So we don't have to endorse until September. But what we don't have right now is an indication of the properties of some of these other options from the design. They're all going to be worse than the base, potentially drastically worse. But the reduced loss one, that's pretty limited. Any idea like what the magnitude would be of that? The CVs and that?
So yeah, we have an idea because we have the CVs from last year, which is moving in that direction. And so I can get those to you, but from 2024. So we do have some high CVs already in some of these areas, upwards of 25%, I think. In areas like 4A, I have to check it. Yeah, and this would, if we see, less than or equal to 25% as a target range, we'll be exceeding that range in a design that doesn't. And we did look, that is something we looked at in much more detail when we did the evaluations a year or two ago. We did the base block design, but we also had a couple others. Call them reduced core design or something, where we reduced the sampling in the core of the stock, and then something that was even reduced from that. I've forgotten the names that we had. But one was the third one was it was like doing half the sampling in the core of the stock and sampling other stuff, and only doing the core of the stock, not sampling the ends of the stock. That's right. And so that's not so far off the reduced loss design. And we did project it out, I think, 5 years into the future. And now, did incorporate those in some of your senior analysis. Was it 3 years? Maybe it was 3. But yeah, so I can pick those up, but they give you a sense of how quickly. It's something like CVs will increase something like 5 or more %. It doesn't take
The
too
cost
long.
of that design goes far beyond the CVs.
Exactly.
CV of 25% sounds great in most cases, but the potential for bias and all the simulations that we did last year showing that bias will translate into management. That's the real cost. We won't know it until we see the consequences.
Yeah, that's a harder thing to communicate, isn't it?
It is.
And we did,
Even with the simulations we did last year, it's difficult to reconcile.
yeah, I mean, we had a back of the envelope calculation of potential bias and based on the changes we've seen. And we see changes in the order of 15% each year when we've been sampling this stuff. We get changes 15% or more in my regulatory area by biological region. And so you add that up over multiple years and expand it out, the potential for bias is very large. And so we did come up with a back of the envelope calculation based on what wasn't being sampled, assuming we get sample part right. And then we have maybe plus or minus 15% everywhere else. We came up with a number of potential for bias from so the worst case scenario or realistic case. So we did try to communicate that a little more quantitatively last year to commissioners. And we had some figures showing from the space-time model, the estimated change on a 1 year basis, on a 3 year period by regulatory area and the biological region. I think people were surprised at how quickly it changed even over a relatively short period of time. So, but yeah, that's probably as much as we can do for projecting bias potential. Yeah.
For
Communicating.
September, are you gonna do some more simulations to get some idea of the TCUI implications of these, or was that?
That was a big piece
That's
of
not-
work. Yeah.
What would be feasible in the time we get the information? We have just a couple of weeks by the time all the survey information's finalized and they're actually making decisions about it. That was a summer-long effort to illustrate it. But yeah, it's not informational at all.
And I can update back of the input calculations, broad sense of how big the potential for bias is once we've done the survey. That's probably as far as we can do. I think they appreciate seeing
I
that.
think the most compelling examples are going to be when we revisit one of these charter regions that we haven't been to in 5 years. And we can compare the results, because then we can actually quantify what the bias was in the intervening time period. Until we get a couple of examples of that, and it's worse than we think, and maybe it's better, but until we get a couple of examples, it's just pretty theoretical at this point.
So this year is going to provide at least a couple of examples. And to a lesser extent, in parts of 2A as well. But it's still not as long a period of time as some of these areas there. So
Anything else? Yes.
So lunch is here if you want to break early for the lawns.
You have the management supporting us.
The-
Oh, that's right, in a whole other section.
We don't have anything on management.
How long is yours?
Depends, this one typically runs a little bit longer than expected of questions.
Maybe we can run over lunch. It's good time in the afternoon.
We can break for lunch and.
I recommend breaking for lunch.
Yeah, sounds good.
Come back in an hour.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody listening online. So we're going to break now for lunch for an hour. Back at 1 p.m. Thank you.